Well, my name is Noah Martin, and I worship with the Green Oaks congregation in Arlington, Texas. And I've been asked to speak on the relationship that we have as Christians to popular culture. And specifically, I was invited to offer kind of a fresh perspective coming from someone who's a little bit younger. As we'll learn, pop culture is really kind of trendy. It's kind of relevant to what's going on in the world around us today. Our key passages are on the screen. We'll get to those in a little bit. We're also going to be diving into two specific aspects of pop culture, which is tattoos, and then also video games, which I heard talked about during some of that lunch chat. So we'll dive into that a little bit more in a little bit. So we're going to study about our relationship with the world around us and what is called pop culture. I want to start by defining the terms here. This was a helpful book that was recommended to me by David Griffin and a couple others that kind of got me started on this topic. It's called The Tattoo Jesus, written by Kevin Swanson. And he defines culture as the life or way of living of a family and of community. And it's manifested, the way that we see it is through language, literature, dress, manners, music, architecture, art, and work. And so that's culture. That's kind of like the way of life that as we think about it. Now, pop culture is a little bit more specific. It's the more prevalent beliefs or practices and objects of a society's culture that are generally translated via mass media and aimed toward the younger generations. And so some examples of that include movies, TVs, video games, clothing fads, slang, social media, just about any technology craze, whatever latest thing you can think about makes up our nation's popular culture. And this culture is one that's ever changing as things and ideas come and go in popularity with each new day. However, there is a trend with these things, and we're going to notice that you can probably already see as the years pass on, pop culture, what's popular around us, tends to drift further and further away from the principles of godly living that are laid out for us in the scriptures. Now, the idea of culture, we start our lives with some kind of baseline. So here is a chart relating, some siblings when they're born in their family, they kind of have the same foundation where they start. But naturally, as their lives go on and things change around them, perhaps their thinking is influenced by the culture of the day. You might think about this in the way that your current lifestyle differs from that of your parents. Perhaps growing up, this was one that was true for me. I couldn't have dessert unless my plate was clean. And so as the respectful and obedient child that I was, you did what was asked of you and you cleaned your plate every night. But now as an adult, perhaps my trajectory has moved away from the baseline that was set by my parents. Maybe I snack a little bit before dinner, or maybe I don't finish my food, but I still enjoy a little bit of banana pudding after I eat. Of course, the changes are often of greater consequence than of choosing when to eat our sweets, but you get the point. Our beliefs and our values and things like that can change over time based on how we're influenced by what goes on around us in our personal life culture and in the culture outside of that. And it's an ever-changing beast that's not easily tamed in the Christian's life. There is this constant tug of war between Christianity and worldliness. And Paul speaks about that battling that we have with our flesh. It has been and always will be this way. And so we ask, what direction will the culture move next? And what are we to do about it? One, we could isolate ourselves from society and just live in a bubble. But that would make spreading the gospel a little difficult, wouldn't it? We could, refuse God's ethical standards and just join the world in its pattern of faithlessness and of compromise. But Paul tells us in Ephesians 5:11 that we're to have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. So that one doesn't really work. But number 3, I like this one. And I think it will lead us to wholeness and fulfillment in Christ. Door number 3, we remain steadfast and we do what we can to impact the culture around us for the better. We're in the world, but we're not of it. And so we got to learn to walk in wisdom. Now we want to look at our primary text as a starting point, Romans chapter 12, the first two verses. Paul writes, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So Christians are called to be separate from the world regarding the things that we love and the things that we give our time to. And Paul writes that our minds are to be transformed to a higher calling. And that comes from God's perfect will. But if we just live our lives as physical humans on this earth, how are we going to be able to keep from loving all the things that may be popular around us, but also not edifying to our spiritual journey? And therein lies the challenge that we want to address in our study. Another passage we're going to look at today is Hebrews 5, verses 12 through 14, specifically verse 14, but to get a little context, we'll start in verse 12. The Hebrew writer says, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you again the first principles of the oracles of God, and you have come to need milk and not solid food. For everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food belongs to those who are of full age. That is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. So the Hebrew writer makes a distinction between those who are young in the faith and those who are mature in the faith. And this is not necessarily tied to our physical age. The mature can discern good and evil because they've had their senses exercised, which means that they've practiced mindfulness and they've walked in wisdom through their years of forming habits and perspectives while living and engaging with a fallen world. And so in short, the decisions that we make today have the potential to greatly impact our future. And I think that coming from a young person's perspective, this is something that we don't really think about a lot. I don't think about a lot how I'm going to be when if I get to live to be 70, 80 years old, how the choices I'm making right now will impact it, but it's the truth. And it especially relates to our thoughts and our actions and what we allow into our lives. So before we get into tattoos and video games, I want to just establish some guiding principles that we can use from the scriptures. We're not going to find a lot of specific teachings related to these two topics, mainly because they weren't a part of the popular culture during ancient times. However, we find Paul gives this statement about the word of God in 2 Timothy 3, 16 through 17, that it can equip us for anything. And I think especially this phrase, instruction in righteousness, is what we're going to be looking for today, that we can use wisdom principles that are found in the scriptures to help us make some deductions as we approach our relationship to pop culture. And so we wonder, what does God say through the inspired writers? Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 23 through 24, Paul writes, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. And Paul introduces this idea earlier in chapter 6 and verse 12 of the same letter. And he's speaking to a people who have been freed from the law of Moses, and now they're under the law of liberty, but they've begun to justify their behaviors, which sometimes have selfish intent. And Paul reminds them that just because you're free now doesn't mean that you, one, have a license to sin if one of the things you're doing is a sin, and two, it doesn't mean you need to consider indulging in everything that is a matter of liberty. And so we're going to take two discerning questions throughout our study today. The first one that comes from this passage is whatever this liberty is, this thing I want to do, is it going to be helpful to me or to my fellow man? Is it going to be helpful? Secondly, in Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 through 24, Paul is speaking to bondservants, and he writes, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. And he gives a similar idea in verse 17 of Colossians 3. He says, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. And so Paul is encouraging us to be sincere and to allow the fear and our reverence of God to inform our speech and our actions in this life. He says, don't follow the crowd, follow the Creator. And so we ask ourselves from this passage, discerning question number 2, can I do this thing that I want to do in the name of the Lord? And can I give thanks to God for the opportunity to do this thing? We've got to be mindful of our faith when we make decisions about matters of freedom, and to fail to do so is to forget God. We can read in the Old Testament what happened when people forgot God, in the account of the flood and the captivity years of Israel. When they forgot God, their plight was miserable. We don't want to make those same mistakes. So with these guiding principles in mind, we're going to move on now to explore some more specific topics of popular culture. The first one we'll look at today is tattoos. Now, the English word for tattoo entered our vocabulary late in the 1700s, coming from the Tahitian word tatau. And this word meant pigment design in the skin. And it was found in the journals of a British explorer by the name of Captain James Cook. Now, obviously, there was a time when tattoos in America were mainly associated with those who kind of walked a grungier side of life, like biker gangs and sailors and convicts. And I say was because if we haven't noticed, this trend has changed drastically the last few decades or so as tattoos have become more mainstream as a form of self-expression and of individualized artistry. A few surveys here, one from September this year, they surveyed a group and found that 74% of participants admitted that they had 0 tattoos. So still the majority is that a lot of people don't have them. 9% had 1, 17% had multiple. So of those who had tattoos, more of them had multiple tattoos. Another survey from a few years back, they asked, do you have a tattoo? And I think it's interesting that the biggest number is those who said no, and it's not an option for me. So we see that a few years ago, there was still some opposition for various reasons as to why people chose not to have tattoos. But obviously, these are just numbers. They don't stand in for the entire population, but they do show us some trends relating to an increase in the popularity of tattoos in the American public. I see a rise in young people, especially some of my peers, even some of those in the church who either desire to get a tattoo, are following through with getting a tattoo, or they just think that they look cool. They're intrigued by them. I think tattoos are interesting. I think they're kind of cool. But, it's not as controversial as it once was when less people had them. Just about any trip you make outside your home, you go to the grocery store, you go to the gas station, you're probably going to come across somebody who's got some ink somewhere. Now, before we go any further with our understanding of what's happening now, I want to look at the scriptures to see what they have to say. What does God have to say regarding tattoos? Now, obviously, the first place most people will go if they're thinking about tattoos is Leviticus 19:28. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks on you. I am the Lord. And this is Moses giving the moral and ceremonial laws from God. Now, it's notable that you could take this verse and you could run with it, right? Which some people do. But context is so important. The verses right before and the verse right after it are all giving other prohibitions that the children of Israel had to do. They couldn't eat meat that had blood in it. They couldn't practice divination, shaving or disfiguring the hair or trimming the beard. These were things they weren't allowed to do. And we wonder why is that, right? It's interesting also that the King James Version, which was translated in the 1600s, which was prior to the development of the word tattoo, just says, you shall not print any marks on you. Now, there's another passage where we find about tattoos a little bit, is Deuteronomy Chapter 14, verses 1 and 2. You are the children of the Lord your God, and you shall not cut yourselves, nor shave the front of your head for the dead, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God, and the Lord has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Now, both of these passages place restriction on the nation of Israel regarding tattoos upon the skin, and they're linked to this kind of funeral practice. It says for the dead. More specifically, in Deuteronomy, it mentions that this is linked to maintaining a distinction in physical appearance against the practices of the surrounding pagan nations. Now, pagan mourning rituals encouraged this type of physical abuse of cutting oneself and even of tattooing the skin as a way of exerting their control over their own well-being, or even as an appeal to the false gods they worshiped. And we can read about one of those instances in 1 Kings 18 and verse 28, where it mentions the prophets of Baal were cutting themselves until the blood flowed in an attempt to appeal to their God. And so these pagan tattoo practices from which God commands his people to dissociate are given in the context of honoring the dead and of honoring false gods, or of idolatry. Now, as Deuteronomy teaches, the reason for this prohibition wasn't so focused on the act itself. And when you think about the context of Leviticus, it's like, why are there so many strange commands going on here? Well, a lot of that was based on appearance. God's people were to be holy. They were to be set apart from those that they were around. And remember, of course, this is the conquest period. And so God was leading them to Canaan. Every time they battled, they had to completely drive out the inhabitants of that nation. They were told not to intermingle or marry with the people who were not of the Jewish line. And so logically, how could they remain pure if they became so involved in the practices of that culture and of the lives of those people? That kind of makes me think of the idea of being unequally yoked, right? He was telling them, you're set apart, and I want you to stay away from these things for this very reason. So those are all Old Testament references. Now, in the New Testament, we really don't find much. In Revelation 19, there is a brief visual described in which some people believe this might imply that Jesus had a tattoo. It says, and he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Now, I would quickly dismiss this interpretation primarily because there's so much figurative language in the book of Revelation. The language cannot all be taken literally. But if we were to take it literally, I think it would probably be easier to say that maybe the wording is found on the garment part that covers his thigh. I don't think that Jesus would be showing that part of his body. Another passage worthy of our consideration is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 18 through 20. This is where Paul reflects on the treating of the body. And as earlier in this chapter, we already read a little bit, he references all things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. He goes on now to mention the way that sexual sin can affect the body, which is especially problematic for those who've given their lives to Christ. He says, flee sexual immorality, for every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who's in you, whom you have from God, and you are not your own? For you were bought at a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. Now, I know that there are some who believe this body that's being referred to here is speaking of the church. And there's some earlier writing that Paul does in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 that kind of lends to that interpretation. And some of that has to do with the way that we balance our view of how the Holy Spirit works within us. And I want to just recognize that that's not what we're here to debate or to really to discuss today. But within the context of sexual immorality, that is such a physical sin, and it is committed with our physical bodies. And so to say that there's no physical body being referenced here, I think that would kind of leave out some of the meaning that Paul is saying here, because sexual sins, that's such an inner thing. There's such a spiritual level of connection that happens during sex. But at the foundational level, verse 20 is significant to the tattoo conversation. Our bodies are not our own. Paul says, he says, but how often do you and I regard the one who created our bodies when we seek to change our physical selves? And that's kind of lead us into our next section, which is on application. The prohibition of tattoos, we don't find it carried over explicitly into the New Testament law. And if one were to say that Leviticus is the prohibition to define modern tattooing as sin, I think that person would also need to follow the other prohibitions that are linked in that chapter in the context of that passage. And so to me, this seems like it would be a freedom matter, a liberty matter. But if it is a freedom, what does it matter? If if I get one? We want to explore some of those things. And so we want to revisit our discerning questions. If I'm going to get a tattoo, will my tattoo be helpful or edifying to me or to others? And number two, can I get a tattoo as to the Lord giving? If we can't answer yes to both of those questions, then I think that we should really stop and reconsider our course of action. Something tattoos are super expensive sometimes. They're permanent. They last a very long time, and they don't always turn out as they're planned. You may find that you get a poor artist, and there you have that tattoo for the rest of your life. It's poorly drawn on your body. We think about how our bodies change when we get older. Young people, we really don't think about how our bodies are going to look when we're 70 and 80 years old, and your tattoos are going to look kind of gross as your body has sagged and different things have changed. Am I willing to accept these consequences for the rest of my earthly life as I think about how that can influence the way that I communicate and spread the gospel with others? Maybe a t-shirt or a sticker might be a better way to express my own personal interests to the world around me. Tattoos draw attention to our bodies, and I really don't think there's a way that you can get around this unless it's a hidden tattoo. If I don't like people staring at me, I shouldn't get one. If I do like people staring at me, then perhaps I have a deeper heart problem that I need to fix, which is one of the modesty mindset. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, the writer there speaks to the outward adorning versus my inward attitude. And God places so much more emphasis on our hearts, on the inward attitude. He desires that we focus on the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. And when I think about a tattoo, a lot of times tattoos are pretty loud. What message will my tattoo convey? You know, the images that we put on our body, they all have something to say. I've seen Christians get tattoos of Greek gods on their bodies, and I'm like, what are you doing? Because that is so close to doing what they did in Leviticus, you know, to put foreign things on your body in such a way. And you know, you get any number of images on your body, but honestly, if we're thinking about this as a matter of liberty, I think that scriptural tattoos are really the only ones that I can find some kind of value in. Perhaps, you know, a verse or a word. I've seen people get symbols that remind them on their hands or their arms throughout the day. Maybe a tattoo can become something that prompts discussion in public. Obviously, that's not supposed to be our first inclination of how to spread the gospel, but if you had something like that, I suppose it could help. But most importantly, if I truly believe that scripture does not condemn tattoos, I need to consider my motive. Why am I getting this? Many of my peers in the younger generation, they see tattoos as a means of self-expression or of finding identity, be it through a subculture of having tattoos, or be it through identity in the way that I look, in my appearance. People will say, you know, this is the way that I want to define myself. And then they'll go on to permanently alter the body that God's given them. And this motive of self-will, I want to do this to define myself, it kind of runs counter to our faith, if you think about it. Again, Paul reminds us we're not our own. We're bought with a price, so we have to glorify God in what we do with our bodies. And really, this attitude of self-will is kind of unhealthy, and even worse, it's sinful. God has made us to be just the way that he wants us. We were formed in his image. What a beautiful thing that is, right? Where does God want us to seek our identity? Is it in our physical expression of who we are in that way? Galatians 2 and verse 20, Paul says, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loves me and who gave himself for me. And so my identity should be found in Christ. We need to think about the worldview that tattoos convey. What is, as we looked at that graph earlier, what's the trajectory of my heart behind the desire to get one? Is my belief in God and about my intrinsic self-worth exemplified in my desire to change my physical appearance? Or do I fully trust that God has made me who he's desired me to be, and that I have the things necessary to be the best version of myself? So with these things in mind, I personally struggle to see how getting a tattoo is a sound idea, even if it is technically a liberty. However, I suppose if you can do it in good conscience, if you've prayerfully approached the Lord and all of those things, then you getting that would be between you and God just as much as any other matter of freedom might be. And for me to make an assumption about your life based on you exercising that freedom, that would be a poor choice on my part without having some kind of conversation with you first. And so going back to our main text, Romans 12, present your body as a living sacrifice. Is that my aim if I'm getting a tattoo? Is that what I want to do? Hebrews 5:14, thinking about discerning good and evil. When I'm young and desiring, usually it's mostly the younger crowd, desiring to get a tattoo, have I reasoned through everything enough to merit a change that will stick with me for the rest of my life? So lots to digest there. We're going to move on now to the next part of our study, which is the topic of video games. And I was so excited to be invited to talk on this because I am a super gamer. I know that the age group here in our crowd is a little bit higher, so maybe you're not as acclimated to gaming as some others might be, but I'll just tell you, I got started really early back in 3rd grade when I saved up my allowance for a whole year to buy a Nintendo GameCube, and it's been Mario and Zelda for me ever since. I love the world building, I love the storytelling, I love the art, the depth, and just the general fun that video games can offer. And all of that has only grown with time and with advances in technology. And I want to start this portion of our study by dispelling the myth that video games are a complete waste of time, because I know a lot of people think that. But they're also, and that's kind of the point, right? You're passing the time to get lost doing something you love during your leisure. And the writer in Ecclesiastes, he talks about enjoying your life and the gifts that God has given you in those ways. I think that video games are no more wasteful than any other hobby that people might have, be it sports, hunting, crafting, making music, etc. I mean, it's just a way that you pass time. Your perspective of that may differ. But if you have young people in your congregation, chances are they've played a video game or two or 50. In a survey conducted by the Entertainment Software Association, here's just some facts for you. They found last year that 55% more people played games during the pandemic. And the top reasons were for stress relief and for distraction. 74% of parents in the survey said that they play games with their child weekly. Most video gamers are in their 30s. 80% of them are over 18. So we have a large population of adults. The majority are male. But more than half of all gamers played 7+ hours weekly. You might look at that and say, man, that's a lot of time. But I also think most of us probably spend 7+ hours doing something we love in our own free time during the week. And that may even be just you sitting on the couch, wasting time scrolling through your phone. You may not think of that as a hobby, but if that's what you're doing for that many hours a week, it's no different than somebody playing video games, right? So how do video games fit into pop culture and into Christianity? What are the aspects of gaming about which we need to be discerning? A lot of these elements we're going to study today can be applied to other media entertainment as well, like the way that we pick our shows and our movies, if you're inclined to watch those things. The first part of video games we're going to talk about is content. Very few video game stories operate in the Christian worldview. In most environments and decisions that you see crafted before your eyes on the screen, there is an absence of God. Not that the world was created to be different than the physical world in which we inhabit, which we know was created by God, but there's just not a lot of religion that is referenced or given insight in video games. And so with that in mind, we have to remember that most people out there and a lot of video game creators, they don't see sin the way that God sees it. And, you know, for you and I as believers, that's even a struggle that we grapple with too, as our pursuit of holiness. You know, we're always having to go back to the drawing board and see, what does God say about this? Because my conscience is telling me otherwise, and I need to, you know, see sin the way that he sees it. Are we able to actively separate the bad from the good as we play? Or do we sink into the comfort of the couch and turn off our brains for a few hours and claim ignorance in the sight of God. That's so dangerous, but that's what we do a lot of the times. Video games, movies, TV, we just kind of turn it off and enjoy whatever there is. Perhaps the greatest danger, though, that's posed by the media we consume on the screen is the way it can desensitize us to sin. And really just about anything goes in video games, especially when a game is rated M for mature. And most of the popular games today have that rating. I want to look at one specific example here. And this is a game called Grand Theft Auto. It's one of the most popular video game franchises of the last decade. Each iteration, this is the fifth one, each one has you playing a character who gets caught up in a life of crime. And you're given a sandbox open world, which is a type of game where they build this massive world and you can kind of go anywhere, do anything you want and explore it. And in that open world, you can drive around, you can kill people, you can go to strip clubs, you can rob banks, perform great heists, you name it. And there's F-bombs galore, as the rating here tells us. Now, most M games usually have violence and sometimes language and sometimes a little bit of sex. Most of them don't have all of these things, but this is one that really bothers me because I do see my Christian brothers, and there's probably some sisters out there too, playing this game for hours and hours on end. And, you play this game online with your buddies, it becomes entertaining. As the hours go by, you sink away your life into this game. The language no longer bothers you. The violence becomes just a means to an end. And then we forget the fact that we're just vicariously living a life of sin through the screen. We got to be exceedingly careful that we do not become so enamored with a presentation that we ignore its message. Entertainment is normalizing these immoral ways of living. And by choosing to ingest these things, sometimes we may not be separating ourselves unto holiness. Philippians 4 and verse 8 tells us to think on those things that are true, noble, just, pure, lovely, of good report, and virtue. And so before I play a video game, I should be asking myself, is this morally, intellectually, or even spiritually profitable? Or is it a counterproductive use of the time that God has gifted to me? It can be so fun to enter into a new world and escape from reality for a little bit, to experience something that normal life cannot offer. But like our principal text of Hebrews 5 and 14, we've got to learn to be able to discern between the good and the evil using God's word. Am I edified by driving the streets of Grand Theft Auto where I can kill, curse, and steal as I please? Is my love for fellow man affirmed when I take on the role of a pragmatic hero who goes around slaughtering all those people who have wronged him? How can I stand? This is a tricky one. How can I stand by my status as a conscientious objector if I'm playing Call of Duty all the time? This is a series of games that's all about war, right? And so many Christians play these games for fun, where you just shoot to kill over and over and over. And you're role playing the very thing that we say we would morally object to in real life. Now, I know it's a simulation, but really, simulated sin, though I may not be preferring it myself, what I'm seeing on the screen is still sin, because that is an objective thing. Isaiah 5 verses 20 and 21, the prophet says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light, light for darkness. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. And that's sometimes what we do when we say, I can handle this. That's what happens with a lot of our entertainment choices. We say, it doesn't affect me. I'll be okay. I can still be a Christian and also do this thing. Are we not calling ourselves wiser than God? We got to be careful of endorsing evil entertainment as good fun. Often we should instead be turning the other way instead of straining the gnat and swallowing the camel as we look for some redeemable shred that'll let us keep playing. Proverbs 3 and verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. It's so often that we just walk out into God's world and we forget about him. When the reality of God fades into our consciousness, as it often does with our entertainment, we just turn our brains off. Reality fades with it. 1 Peter 5 and 8 warns us to be vigilant because the devil is out there trying to pounce on us. And I think that the throes of pop culture can be the simplest, sneakiest device to bring sin into our homes and before our eyes daily in a way that we may not notice. Another aspect, apart from content, is time. Most AAA blockbuster video games take somewhere between 20 to 60 hours to complete. 20 if you're mainly just trying to get through the story or the campaign, 60 if you're a completionist. So a lot of video games tend to have extra challenges. They have trophy lists or achievements that you can unlock for extra feats once you complete the main part of the game. I love to do that. I'm kind of a completionist myself, but that's a lot of time. Of course, any hobby has the potential to grab too much of our attention, but we know that screen time hobbies can be especially addictive. Growing up at home, my parents, during the school week, it was always, you could have 1 hour of games every day. That was it. And then the summer times, it was, you can do an hour on and then an hour off, just to try to help us rationalize through that. And that early accountability kind of helped me when I became my own person as I lived on my own. But there are definitely days when I look back at the clock and I wonder where the time went. This time black hole can turn video games into an addictive form of idolatry in a matter of days. Idolatry is, of course, anything that we place above our dedication to God. And so when Paul writes about walking in wisdom, he says in Ephesians 5, see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be unwise, but understand what the will of the Lord is. So he's telling us to have our wits about us, avoid contact with undesirable influences, and take advantage of the limited time that we're given. So what is the will of the Lord? Well, that's that Hebrews 5:14 discernment piece resurfacing. I have to be moving from milk to solid food in my own study of the word. Am I going to get there if I spend all my time in the digital void? Not likely. And so we ask our questions. Will playing this video game be helpful or edifying to me and or to others who are with me? And 2, can I play this game as the Lord, giving thanks to God for it? If I can't answer yes to both of those questions, perhaps I should put the controller back on the shelf and find something else to do with my time. And so pop culture exists. It is increasingly influential, especially in the lives of our youth. We have access to so many types of entertainment, literature, and artistry today, more than ever before, but we must be able to make a choice in whether we're going to use wisdom and discernment in our pursuit of these offerings. 1 John 2:15-17 tells us that believers must continue to live in the world, but we cannot love the things of the world. We can have a relationship with the culture and people around us, so long as our relationship with God remains supreme. So we have to remember that true worship begins with the fear of God. Proverbs 16:6, by mercy and truth, iniquity is purged. By fear of the Lord, men depart from evil. And Paul's spirit-driven challenge continues for us today, that we would present our bodies as living sacrifices, not conformed to this world, but transformed by the renewing of our minds. And so it is that in all things, may we consider Christ first and foremost.
Thank you, Noah. You did a really good job of covering that, gave some really good principles that you shared. We're open for questions, comments for Noah. I'm going to read what a sister said, and as you get your questions together, a sister wrote this: I'm enjoying this topic and I'm struggling with this with my children. I speak on this to them a lot, even regarding the movies they watch. And they look at me as being too strict or overprotective or even perceived as controlling. I would love for my children to participate in a youth meeting regarding this topic for reinforcement, because it's present in my home and I could use support from the brethren to help encourage my children. You want to comment on that, Noah?
Sure. Well, to that sister, I agree. I think we need more meetings about this kind of stuff, because it is something that all young people are dealing with. And there's not a lot of guidance given to us in the church. We don't often talk about this. I'll tell you, I came from that strict family. In high school, I kind of bit against my parents a lot. My mom would, before I could listen to any music, she made me write down the song I wanted. She would go check all the lyrics to every song before I could download it. So we were not allowed to watch a lot of things. She would watch every movie I wanted to see before me, make a list of the things she wanted to fast forward through and the timestamps. I know now we have a lot of technology that will filter those things out for us, which are awesome. If you're not already, I would strongly encourage you to get a VidAngel subscription for any of your streaming platforms that you do, because VidAngel will filter out the negative content in Netflix and Amazon Prime and all those things. And, you know, there's also that idea that we're their parents first, we're not their friends. And the things that you do now to help them in relation to that, though it may be difficult for them at the time, they'll become better Christians for it. I know that I'm a lot better as a person now that I'm making my own choices because of the decisions that my parents made to kind of filter and control some of those things for me. So Godspeed as you work through that with your own kids.
Okay, Kanira, you had a comment.
Yeah, Noah, that was a great job with those 2 points you brought up about video games and tattoos and others, but we can also apply those things to anything that's new that's come out in the future, because things will change, because technology will change. My camera's to the side, so that's why I'm looking like that. I got multiple, 3 screens here, so. But I think it was real good. And, you know, I also apply that, you know, Ephesians 5:15, I believe, that you brought up a few minutes ago about being wise in our decisions. Because with video games comes AI things. With video game comes VR technology and anime that's out now that's, you know, that's real popular, that kind of ties to video games, tattoos, and so forth. So that's what I apply similarly to kind of the things that you mentioned, to make sure, you know, my kids are listening to appropriate things and doing appropriate things, and us to talk about those things, because we do live in this world and we can't just, as your first example, put ourselves in a corner like we're not going to ever face it, and try to give those kids the tools as the future holds when they come across these different situations, just as, you know, my parents taught me the tools to use when we get in those situations. And it will be up to them, as you said earlier, to choose to use them. You know, when you first get the freedoms, you spend 9 hours trying to beat this video game. And then you realize, a coworker just asked me the other day when I last played a video game. I said I played it for 20 minutes one morning because I woke up early and everybody was asleep. But once everybody woke up, I hadn't been, and that was 6 months ago. So,
right.
So I appreciate your thoughts on that.
Go ahead, Noah.
I was gonna say, and I would say to that, you know, as a single man who enjoys video games, I recognize, I'm pursuing a woman right now. I recognize that if that leads to marriage, there's going to be a change in my interests and my free time. You know, I'm hopeful that, Lord willing, someday I'll have kids and they'll be all about Mario Kart. You know, but you never know.
For a little while, they are.
Yeah,
they were. So for a little while, they were. So.
Hope.
Noah, there's a question here from Mike Criswell. He says, "Can Noah comment on anime?" Kanira, you just mentioned that. Can Noah comment on anime and its effect on gender dysphoria in young boys who are addicted to this genre? That's on you, Noah.
Okay. I don't have a lot of experience with anime. My brother is really into, my older brother is really into it. I mean, I think with any kind of media, obviously there's drastically different portrayals of genders than there used to be, right? We're seeing the inclusion of homosexuals as just regular characters. We know that, I mean, that's becoming a popular thing. Like, people are around us that are that way. We've got to be able to interact with them. But when it's coming through the screen, or my kids are watching it, or I'm watching it, the way that influences me, I mean, I've got to be careful about not just making that something that is acceptable to me. And that's that desensitization thing. I don't know exactly what anime does with that. I mean, maybe some of the male characters are a little more feminine. I'm not totally sure. If you have more detail on that, I'd love to hear from you.
Maybe somebody on somebody else may have a comment. They may have more experience with it. Okay, I see. Aaron didn't do it.
And Noah Howard has his hand raised that next.
Oh, I didn't see you. Noah, you had your hand up. Oh, I'm sorry. Noah, then Aaron, then do it. I'm sorry, I didn't. The hand just popped up. It takes a while, I guess, for it to pop up.
This is going to get confusing having two no's here.
Noah number
It could
two.
be, hey, it could be more, so this isn't too bad.
Well, I'm afraid I can't really comment on anime. Man, I wish Hayden Ayers was here because he could probably comment, but he's on his honeymoon, so I guess we'll forgive him. This is tough because I have things to say about tattoos and video games, but I'm going to start with tattoos because I don't want to speak for too long. Noah Martin, I think you did a great job presenting an overview of the subject and also the specifics of tattoos in video games. About tattoos, personally, I don't have an interest in tattoos. It doesn't appeal to me, but it is one that I have talked about a lot with fellow young people. And I would say that the place to start with a young person who's considering a tattoo is to ask them why they want to get it. Don't just start by assuming that it's a rebellion thing or that it's a counterculture thing, because really we're moving away from that in society. And like you said, Noah, there's a lot of reasons why somebody might get a tattoo. It might be they want people to look at them and they want to provoke a reaction. It might be an expression of their identity, their interests. It might be a body image thing. They have they're self-conscious about a scar that they've got or that sort of thing. I've also heard, like you mentioned, they wanted a reminder of who they were as a Christian, and so they got a scripture or a cross tattooed. So don't assume why they're getting it. First, it's good to ask the question, why are you getting it? And the way that I always go is to try to help them understand a proper concept of modesty, because it comes down to a principle thing. And I warn them, this isn't a decision to make lightly, because it's quite permanent. You can get a tattoo removed, but it's painful and it's expensive. And sometimes they haven't thought about that. They also haven't thought about how they might be perceived by people. And I say, in a perfect world, people wouldn't automatically just assume because you have a tattoo of any sort that you're a bad person or that sort of thing. But we don't live in a perfect world. We live in a world where people make assumptions. And just consider this might negatively affect your ability to talk about the gospel with people. So just some things to think about there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, with the passing of time, we may see that tattoos become widespread accepted. I know that it is kind of an older generation thing to have that negative vibe because of how it started, right? But we've got to also remember, what is the connotation of a tattoo today? Why is someone getting it? And I think that's a lot of times why the Old Testament passages don't work. Not forgetting the fact that they're Old Testament, but just the idea that that's not really the reason that people are getting them anymore.
Aaron. Go ahead, Aaron. Aaron, and then do it.
Hey, good job, Noah. Appreciated it. I kind of share with you the fascination of tattoos. I come from a very artistic family. Not that I'm an artist, but surrounded by artistic friends. And so it's something that really does appeal to me, and they're very interesting and they can be beautiful. I was thinking about all of this with regard to Kenneth's last topic, with regard to kind of getting to know people and wanting to talk to people. And one of the things with young people, sometimes we don't always know what to talk about or what to ask them about. And we talked about loving them and showing them hospitality and being kind. When we see people with tattoos, and Noah Howard talked about this for a moment, don't just immediately judge and think that they've made a terrible decision or they're a terrible person, because often those tattoos have meanings to people. And if you really want to relate to somebody, if you really want to get somebody to open up and talk to them about their tattoos. It will start a conversation. We don't always know where to start a conversation with people. If someone has a tattoo, they want to talk about it. It means something to them. And so if you want people to learn to trust you and show them that you care, talking about a tattoo with somebody, not that you have to have one, but asking them about their tattoos is something that will open a door to further conversation. Now, you might further conversation say, hey, maybe that tattoo is not the best idea, but now that it's on them, it's there. But if you want to have an open conversation, if you want to figure out where to start a conversation and someone has a tattoo, that's where you can start in a friendly conversation and in a friendly way. I think it's a great place. So that's kind of a point with regard to showing people you care. Talk to them about their tattoos in a way that lets you understand where they're coming from. I have friends and know people in the church who have tattoos that are kind of a remembrance of a date where their friends died in a car accident. And it's a emotional conversation, but they want to have it and they want to talk about it because that's part of their healing process. And so instead of immediately going into the fact that, oh, you're a sinner and you're a terrible person because you have a tattoo, it's a way for people to express something that they want to talk about at times for people. No, that's not that makes everything right. But I'm saying if you want to show people you care, talk to them about their tattoos. Second thing, I wanted to ask you, with regard to your two questions, I liked them. I thought they were good. Will playing video games or will getting a tattoo be helpful, edifying for me and others? How far can we take that question? And what I mean by that is there's a million ways to get a haircut. Do I have to ask that question about getting like every form of haircut? How far do we take that? How far does somebody else's opinion have to dictate the things of my life if it's not opinion, is my question.
That is a good question. And really, I think that's where those matters of liberty kind of come into play, and my willingness to kind of stay in my lane as far as that's concerned with me and God. I mean, you've heard the old saying, practice the presence of Jesus. What would you be doing if Jesus was on the couch next to you? Well, I can tell you, I probably wouldn't be doing anything but worshiping him and, having a conversation with him, right? That changes the whole game. Anything, I think if you think too heavily about it, anything can fail those two questions as long as it's not spiritually related. And that's why when I mentioned the motive, is this going to be profitable for me morally, intellectually, spiritually? I think the spiritual one, there are times of leisure in our life, and that's okay to take a little break, but we also have to remember who we are in those times. So, as far as discernment goes, I think that's kind of on an individual basis. I think that if we have the right motive in that, we'll do it the right way, and we'll be, we're going to be working to be better about it every time we ask those kinds of questions, from being young in the faith, then all the way to maturity.
Okay, Dewey, then Alan.
Noah, I'm Russell Hall. Dewey from Los Angeles. I need to introduce myself. So many new, beautiful young faces and very able preachers of the gospel. I just thank you and I thank God for your talk today. And I appreciate the tools you've given me. I have a young adult daughter who talked to me about getting a tattoo. And so I have a different spirit. I can ask, honey, why? What's going on? These are the tools I think you've given me. And I'm just not gonna jump on the bandwagon and condemning everything, because it forced me to look at myself I'm a great, sports fan, and I spent definitely too much time, doing that. So you've helped me look at myself, and what you've told me is just scrutinize everything that I think, say, and do, because the time is short, and your passages just, communicated that very well to me. Thank you.
I appreciate you sharing that. I'm glad it made you think.
Alan, and then Ken. Then we might have time for one more after those two. Go ahead, Alan.
No, I really appreciated your approach on all this. I appreciated a reasoned approach and some valid questions to consider, rather than a knee-jerk reaction, which ends up getting us in a lot of trouble many times. And I've worked on this idea of some valid questions to ask in these sorts of things from the study that I've done and written on Romans 14 in the commentary that I wrote. But is something commanded? If it's commanded, there's no more discussion. That's what we have to do. But if it's not, is it a violation of my conscience is the next question, which involves the two questions that you are asking as well. If it is a violation of my conscience, that settles the matter, whether it's a violation of someone else's conscience or not. If it isn't a violation of my conscience, is it placing a stumbling block in someone else's path? If it is, then that's the end of the question. I shouldn't be doing it. But if the answer to all of those questions is no, the next question is, do I really want to do this? And there's a series of questions that might be attached to that. Sometimes you might decide because of perception, like Noah Howard brought up perception a while ago, and you might decide it's not wrong to do this, but the perception might not be what I want it to be, and so you decide not to do it. But then he finally says in Romans 14, if you've decided to do this, and it truly fits into a matter of liberty, those other questions that I talked about, if you've decided to do it, then do it and hush about it. Don't try to be an evangelist and make everybody else do it or not do it, as the case might be. But I appreciated your reasoned approach about all of this. But I wanted to ask a question too. From your research into all this and consideration of these issues, how do you think we should approach people? Well, Raymond brought this up in our previous talk, who come to us who are already inked up. We converted a fellow a few years ago, and unfortunately he did not remain faithful, but he's the most inked up person I've ever seen in my life. His head, his face, his neck, his arms, full sleeve. I don't know about his chest and all that, but he's a fully inked up person. What should we do in a situation like that in terms of trying to accept and deal with this kind of person, in your estimation?
That is a good question. I feel like one of the things we can do right now, because I know there's not that situation in every congregation, is prepare our congregations better for accepting visitors and new believers who have a past. So many of us, we grow up in the church, and we've got that tradition background and all of that, and there's not really a lot of challenge that comes to it. But as we're called to go out into the world and find those people, we're going to come across a lot of people who we need better eyes through which we need the eyes of Christ to see them, to love them the way that they ought to be loved. And so if your congregation is better prepared to accept them in that way, then you can start to have those conversations on an easier level, rather than someone coming in and immediately you've got whispers and people afraid to talk. They don't want it. It's the elephant in the room kind of thing. We never want that to be the case, but I mean, I've experienced it, I've witnessed it, that it happens that way. I think, I mentioned that I was doing this study, and one of the guys that I was with, he had a whole sleeve and he wouldn't look at me the rest of the discussion that we had. And that kind of bothered me because I mean, he didn't even know the approach that I was taking to all of this. I think that it's just kind of an ingrained thing. As I studied through this, I was like, my whole life, I've kind of thought that tattoos were a bad thing. And I didn't really have a reason why. And after studying the Bible about it and looking to see, is it carried through to who we are today, it kind of changed my perspective, and it made me a little more honest about what's going on. And obviously you don't want to have those conversations with a person who's just fresh out of the water. We're not trying to just lay down command upon command just to a new convert. That's not the way of love, I don't think. So I think with time, and like was mentioned earlier, with building the relationship, getting to know people, I think we can get to a place where we can be more honest in those conversations.
Another thing that needs to be considered here is not only, what you said is correct about preparing the congregation. This fellow we converted, the congregation didn't have any trouble accepting him as he was. And we would use him in our assembly like we did anybody else. And but you also have to consider the perception that other newcomers might have when they come in and see this situation. And you need to be ready to deal with that also.
I think that's fair.
Okay. One more question. Ken, you're the last question, and then Artie will start the last presentation.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right.
Let me just turn that off. I was heavy on the thing. Okay. So I was in the middle of trying to write to get my thoughts together, so the end of this might be a little jumbled. But I've noticed that people are able, for the most part, to understand that something is a liberty, and the education behind that. We teach that a liberty in itself is not in itself sinful. I've also noticed that the liberty is given to us by God is often viewed in a negative connotation, even if it's not sinful. And so if the liberty is okay, and the negative connotation is related to basically the people's view, why does it seem wrong when a person tries to change the connotation of the people? It seems like if the people have a negative connotation, then you just can never do that liberty until that view changes. So the person that wants to change that view seems to be, would be in the wrong, for example, or it appears they're in the wrong. So my first question is, would they be wrong for trying to change the connotation or the view of society or system that? For example, for a biblical example, imagine with circumcision, not being circumcised was seen as wrong for the Jews, and then they were educated and told, well, it's not a requirement. But for that person that would have said, well, I don't want to be circumcised, even though, because the Bible doesn't say I have to, there still would have been a negative connotation. And with this thought, it would have been like, well, we'll still continue with circumcision because the people don't feel comfortable without it. So what level of education is responsible for the Christian? I guess, which one takes precedent? Are we at the whim of society and just wait till they come on board? And can we influence, how society views something in order to partake in a liberty?
That's a loaded question, man. I get where you're going with liberties having a negative connotation usually. And I think I noticed that in myself in the way that I thought about tattoos before I started this study. And then I was like, wow, all these years, why have I thought this way? And perhaps there are other things, like that. I know there are a lot of liberties that people debate and say that they're not liberties. And it's hard to get people to see the other side when they've already said, no, this is not a liberty, therefore you cannot, and I won't accept you for doing these things. As far as education goes, I think that's one of that's the burden of the beast, right? Is how can I educate people on liberties and such when we're so divided in our thinking, and how liberties are kind of individualized if it's not a command and if it meets through all those gates and things. Because if I get up in the pulpit and I start teaching on this thing that I know brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so don't agree on, though I may have all the scripture in the world to back me up, I may not change their minds, and it may cause other division. Maybe, I mean, maybe it's more of that's like a conversation to have rather than some kind of sermon to give. Because I mean, we're not in the business of trying to stir up trouble. Sometimes it happens. I mean, the truth has to be preached.
I mean, that sounds like by preaching the truth on this liberty, it causes problems, so we should not. I
don't think so. I think one of the ways that I've found with it coming from a sermon perspective is teach the principles. Let the people make their own application, because sometimes it's the specific application that really bothers people. For example, I used that one video game. If there's somebody in my audience who loves that game and they play it all the time, they're going to be incredibly offended and they're going to have a hard time listening to the rest of my thing. If I take the game out and just give some principles and maybe talk about different categories and things, they're probably a lot more accepting, and then they can start in their own minds to rationalize, oh, wait, that game I play all the time has X, 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 X. Maybe it's more of an individual level and, kind of diffusing that way.
Okay, thank you so much. Very good questions, really good questions. Just want to commend you, Noah, on a very good, thorough overview of this area. There are a lot of rabbit holes you could have went down, but I think you responded to the questions well, and you didn't commit yourself to anything that you might think might be super offensive to somebody. So anyway, okay.